Hello everyone, a warm welcome to all of you in this test discussion. Unique Academy has already launched a test series for general studies for upcoming mains examination, which is scheduled in the month of August. The first test was sectional test on history, which included the syllabus topics based on Indian history, including ancient, medieval, modern art and culture, and modern world history. So we conducted this test on 7th of this month, 7th of June, and next sectional test, which would be covering geography and social issues, Indian society, is scheduled on 14th of June, and there will be another discussion for that test as well. This is sectional test which consists of 20 questions, right, on history. So concentrated kind of preparation, right, and it would be difficult to explain 20 questions in say 1 hour or so. I would keep it brief in order to clarify as to how to understand the question, what content are you supposed to write on a particular question that is there in the test series. That is the format of this lecture, right? So GS test 1 model answers. Question number 1, trace the spatial and temporal evolution of Jain architectural traditions across Indian subcontinent. These are two important keywords. You should divide your answer in these two parts. Question is about evolution of Jain architectural traditions in two parts. So how region-wise you see variation, region-wise, and second temporal means what? In terms of time. And this is temporal evolution, how it evolved, how the architecture changed from one time to another time in terms of phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 of the evolution, right? Let's look at the important points in the answer, right? So you see the temporal evolution in this manner. Simple ascetic rock cut shelters. The initial structures reflect a simplicity that was valued by early Jainism, right? So simple, ascetic and rock cut. These were not structural kind of buildings. These were rock cut buildings, right? So carving in the rock, right? And simple ones without much sculpture or ornamental work, right? And then it evolved into massive fortified western temple cities and southern monolithic complexes out of a single rock, right? So this is the temporal evolution stage 1. This is temporal evolution stage 2, and you can say stage 3, not stage 3 as such, but 2.1, 2.2, something like that. And it also tells us the spatial variation, the western part and southern part. We know that Jainism, Buddhism both emerged in what can be called as north and eastern part of India, Bihar, Magad region, right? But eventually Jainism spread to western India and south India. So to say the area of Gujarat, Saurashtra, Rajasthan, parts of MP, right? And in Karnataka particularly. So there is regional variation, spatial variation in terms of these two regions. So you are supposed to explain this. Simple ascetic rock cut shelters to massive fortified cities 1 and massive monolithic complexes. That is architectural evolution in temporal sense. And then in terms of region, there was different kind of style in western part of India and southern part of India as far as Jain structures are concerned. In western part, those were massive and fortified cities, right? And here, monolithic complexes. So all these things are explained in this answer. I would keep it brief because, you know, we have to cover some 20 odd questions, right? So spatial and temporal evolution, you can see it here. So Eastern genesis, ascetic roots, right? And in that, how it temporally evolved. Spatial focus was Magad, as I said, beginning Mahapewa and Kaling, right? Evolutionary character born in the cradle of second urbanization. So this is nothing but period of Mahajanpadas. Period of Mahajanpadas. And this is second because Harappan civilization happens to be the first urbanization, right? And it was strictly utilitarian and non-structural. It was non-structural because it was rock cut, right? Okay. So developments, early Mauryan rock cut caves. So this is rock cut kind of architecture, like Barabar caves, Vasa caves, right? Under Kharvel, this expanded into Udaygiri and Khandagiri caves, right? So these are all rock cut kind of architectural examples as far as Jain structures are concerned. Vasa is temporary shelter in the rock cuts caves, right? Okay. Then Central Deccan tradition, structural experimentation. So from rock cut to structures, right? That experimentation can be seen here. Spatial movement is being talked about. Then the evolutionary character. In terms of region, they went to Deccan and the central India, and how it evolved. From rock cut excavation to freestanding structural temples, absorbing prevailing regional styles, Nagar and Dravid styles. So these styles were sort of absorbed, assimilated, combined, and structural temples were created. That is the architectural evolution, which can be seen here. Then examples are given. In Deccan, Ellora, in Karnataka, Megadu Jain temple, Aihole temple, at Aihole, sorry. So these are the examples. And then you shift to the next stage, that is medieval divergence, high ornamentation. It started with simplified kind of structures, simple structures, because Jainism gave a lot of emphasis on austerity initially. But later on, Jain communities grew and mostly rich merchants joined Jainism, and then you see ornamentation coming in, right? That is the next stage as far as Jain architecture is concerned. So high ornamentation, that is medieval divergence. Again, that spatial kind of variation has been given, right? So Western expansion, Shwetambar hegemony. Southern expansion, Digambar hegemony. Shwetambar features, Digambar features. It may look like a lengthy answer for you, right? How to reduce that into what can be called as a 10 marker, 150. You can do that by taking only the salient features, right? This has been given to you because you should know this content. That is the purpose behind giving the entire content, so that if a specific question comes on, say, Southern Jain architecture or Central Western Jain architecture, you should be in a position to write that answer as well. And that's why we don't really keep in mind the word limit while giving model answers. The purpose is to bring information to you, to bring knowledge to you, right? Then the fourth next stage is sacred hilltops, 16th century onwards. And you can see that spatial movement, Gujarat, Rajasthan, Madhya Pradesh. And there are, temples which are on the top of a hill, right? That can be seen in a number of places. So examples are given, right? So this is the temporal and spatial kind of variation, change, evolution in Jain architecture. Question number 2. While Greco-Indian encounter was historically fleeting, right, its cultural, artistic repercussions were profound, substantial. Please understand Alexander's invasion, right, and then Seleucid Empire, and thereafter Indo-Greeks, right? So all these things happened in the frontier regions of India. Indian mainland was, frontier regions of India. Indian mainland was never penetrated by Indo-Greeks, right? So in Indus Valley particularly, and some parts of, North India, Northwest India, that is where you see presence of Indo-Greeks. So that way, it did not bring any kind of major change, politically speaking, socially speaking, but culturally it was profound, right? And that is the statement, and we have to substantiate it, right? Okay, so direct presence, political presence was brief in the sense during Alexander's campaign, these are the years, and during the reign of Indo-Greek kingdoms, this is the time period. So in a grand time scale, it's a quite small kind of time period. However, the cultural synthesis was enduring. It was seminal. It has got influence on sculpture, architecture that followed, right? So Gandhar art stands out as a school that demonstrates the fusion of Indian elements and Greco-Roman elements, and we have to substantiate that. It's not just about architecture. Number of other things, other fields were also influenced. You can see it here. So one, evolution of Buddhist iconography, and in Gandhar school you see that all those things, the clothing style, the body language, right, the posture, right, the physique, hair, curly hairs and all those things, that reminds us of the Roman Greek tradition of depicting a human body in sculpture. Apart from that, scrolls and designs, Apollo look like Ushnish, that is the top knot resembling Apollo and all that. You can clearly see that in terms of stylistic fusion, right? Then architectural structural syncretism. Not much has survived, but they had some kind of influence on Mauryan architecture as well, right? So Corinthian capitals, friezes, scroll work into Indian monastic architecture. If this would have been a regular lecture, I would have shown these things, right? What is capital? It is right at the top of a pillar. So somewhere here, this is capital, right? So that design, and then friezes, scroll work, right? All these things I would now, if you don't know these things, these technical terms of architecture, you should visit Google and try to see the picture of it so that you get exact meaning of what we are trying to say here, right? So urban planning is another important aspect. Cities like Sirkap, Takshila were rebuilt using symmetrical Hellenistic grid iron layout. That is sort of an influence on urban planning. Then yes, numismatic revolution. It was as good as a revolution because before Indo-Greeks we had simple, crude punch mark coins, right? Simple, crude kind of punch mark coins. These were replaced by die-struck bilingual Greek and Kharoshthi Brahmi metallic coins, and more importantly, there were realistic royal portraits. So for the first time in India, Indo-Greek started those kinds of coins which can be ascribed to a particular king, and thereby you know which king issued which coins, right? So that is important contribution of Indo-Greeks. And by the way, they were first to use gold coins in India. So they were first to use gold coins in India, and first to use gold coins on a very large scale, Kushanas, right? Okay. Astronomy, literature, philosophy, you can see influence on these fields as well, right? So science, Indian astronomy assimilated Greek concepts. How do you substantiate that? Give an example. So Gargi Samhita mentions Yavan Jatak as an evidence of mastery of Greeks over the subject of astronomy, right? Then philosophy, we know Milind Prashna. So Buddhist philosophy and discussion on that between Naxin and the Menander, that is the Indo-Greek king, right? Then calendar, era and astrology, another area where you see that fusion. These two concepts were introduced by Indo-Greeks in India, right? And there was influence of Greek astrology on Indian astrology. The example is the inclusion of Paulus in the 5 doctrines of astrology by Varahamihir. Varahamihir wrote a book called Panch Siddhantika. Out of those 5 schools of astrology that he enlisted, one was Romic school that indicated the Roman influence, and another was Paulus. And Paulus refers to the classical Greek astronomer, Paul of Alexandria. Though Alexandria is in Egypt today, right? It was part of what is called Hellenistic world at that time, right? So you can clearly see number of areas being influenced by Indo-Greeks, right? Question number 3. Indian folk paintings serve as vibrant mirror to the country's multifaceted cultural diversity, right? Explain with examples. Let's go through it. So give examples and tell exactly what they depict, right? Okay. So we'll quickly go through this. So geographical and ecological diversity. So how do they reflect cultural diversity, right? One is geographical, ecological diversity. So Madhubani painting, for example, right? So it reflects lush agrarian ecosystem of Gangetic plains. So the painting is reflecting the context, geographical context, right? Then Pithora painting practiced by Bhil and Bhilala tribes. These paintings depict local wildlife and more importantly, the importance of horses in their rugged terrain, difficult terrain for transportation, right? So this is how they reflect the geographical diversity, paintings, right? Then social and anthropological diversity. So tribals versus agrarian. So Warli painting in Maharashtra, it shows what? Tribal egalitarianism. How we see more equality in tribal people as compared to those who were called civilized, right? Whenever people become civilized, they create hierarchy, whereas tribals have more egalitarian kind of society. It also captures the communal harmony, right? And this is the example, Tarpa dance, right? Now, one more example, you can see it here. Patachitra, right? It reflects Bhakti movement and Jagannath culture. So this cultural aspect is reflected here. So different paintings reflecting different parts of different aspects of culture. So paintings reflect the cultural diversity. And you can go on adding more examples like those showing religious and mythological syncretism. Kalamkaris showing narratives of Ramayana, Mahabharata, fort paintings showing folk deities, right, in their painting, right? Then pluralistic and syncretic kind of traditions, which again underline the cultural diversity in the subject matter of paintings, right? So Charial scroll painting, local folklore alongside Puranic text. So Puranic text alongside local kind of things, that's kind of mixing you see here in this scroll painting and the Kalighat paintings. Here you see folk techniques blended urban and colonial realities. Both rural, urban and colonial kind of realities are reflected here, right? So this is the answer of what? How folk paintings reflect the cultural diversity in India, right? Question number 4, analyze the role of Bengal School of Art. Very important, right? In fostering sense of Indian nationalism by reviving indigenous artistic techniques during 19th century cultural awakening. We have to spend a little bit of time here because many students don't know how art and culture was an important instrument, media, through which the royal hegemony was established, right? Mughal buildings, huge kind of buildings, plinth of some 2-3 storied, and then the structure and the huge dome. All these things were created to generate awe among the people and thereby gain the legitimacy, right? So showing grandeur through buildings and then generating legitimacy. That was sought to be dwarfed by the British when they established their rule. And thereby you see that North Block and South Block coming up in Delhi. We need to understand this. Architecture, literature, paintings, all these things were introduced in India. For example, Gothic architecture is superior. You create that kind of hegemony, right? So when you are hegemonized, then it becomes difficult to wage a struggle against the hegemon. जो आपको dominate कर रहा है उसके खिलाफ लड़ना मुश्किल हो जाता है. And that is why Indian nationalism, which was unique in the world, right, also sought to counter the cultural hegemony imposed by the British. And the question is on that. So, role of Bengal School of Art in fostering the sense of Indian nationalism. Another aspect that I must highlight, India was colonized, we lost our independence to British. We also need to understand that mentally as well we are subordinated, right? Sort of British superiority, right, and how we are inferior. This point was driven home, and we started believing in that, and that has to be overcome in order to launch a struggle and win the independence. And that's why we need to understand that the dipping sense of Indian pride was sought to be revitalized, reinvigorated through Bengal School of Art. That's an important contribution of this school to the Indian freedom struggle, right? How did they do it? And who are the figures? The most notable figures are this: Abhindranath Tagore, E.B. Havel, rejected Eurocentric academic realism and revived indigenous artistic techniques to create a distinct visual vocabulary for Indian nationalism. You need visual vocabulary many a times. I know there is something going on, that cockroach Janata Party, they have created that visual of cockroach. Whether you support that movement or not, that is immaterial. The point is you need some visual vocabulary for people to gather and mobilize, right? So these artists created that visual vocabulary for Indian nationalism, right? Okay, so now let's look at that. Rejecting Western hegemony, something that I was talking about, countering the civilizing mission. For a long time, British justified their rule saying that Indians are barbarians and so are people in Asia and Africa. And British rule for you is providential. You are lucky to have British rule because you will be civilized through British rule. And that's why you should carry the white man's burden. Right? So that is how it was put forth, and that was sought to be countered by Indian, rather Bengal School of Art. So colonial art schools created this kind of picture, right? Swadeshi in art. The Bengal school materialized the Swadeshi movement, right? That was launched by the extremists after partition of Bengal, right? Okay, so liberating the Indian consciousness from intellectual colonization. Please understand, we are not colonized only in terms of territory. We are colonized also in terms of intellectual colonization. So in order to come out of that intellectual colonization, you need to have your own what is called epistemology, art schools, right? So revival of indigenous techniques and pan-Asian fusions, right? That was done by the Bengal School of Art. You can see it here. So the wash technique, for example, right? Japanese influence. So we started preferring wash techniques as against what? The Western techniques. So Abanindranath Tagore integrated the Japanese ink wash technique learned from Kakuzo and Taikan with Indian styles, right? This created misty, ethereal, and meditative atmosphere, contrasting sharply with the sharp materialistic lines of British oil paintings. So we have this kind of tradition, right? Otherworldly, ethereal, and meditative kind of atmosphere, and they emphasize realism through modernity, right? So that's how it was sought to be countered. Then Ajanta and Mughal fresco lineage was highlighted by artists like Nandalal Bose and Asit Kumar Haldar, right? Visited Ajanta Ellora and they tried to revive that. And ancient Buddhist frescoes as well as Mughal Rajput miniatures were highlighted as indigenous kind of art school as against the imperial colonial art that was sort of creating hegemony on Indian mind. Then use of natural Swadeshi material, indigenous material, that was another aspect they sought to promote as being part of Swadeshi movement. So fostering Indian nationalism through visual iconography. So you can see those icons. So Abanindranath Tagore was the one who created the most influential, sort of pictorial kind of symbol, that is Bharat Mata. We know that very well, right? So it has been described here how he created that. Then reclamation of historical mythological greatness. So Ramayana, Mahabharata, these scenes were painted from these epics from Indian history, right? Works like the passing of Shah Jahan, depictions of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. So our own things are to be depicted, our own things are to be glorified as a counter to the Western hegemony, right? Then democratization and rural awakening. All these were very important contributions of Bengal School of Art, right? So Nandalal Bose, right? His Haripura posters were prepared by him on the insistence of Gandhi, right? Mahatma Gandhi told him to do so, right? So commissioned by Mahatma Gandhi, celebrated ordinary Indian workers, right? Merging folk life with the freedom struggle. And we know Haripura session of Congress, INC, was the first session in rural area. So it was Gandhi's attempt to bring that rural area into the mainstream of Indian freedom struggle, right? And he commissioned these paintings. So that's how the painting or the Bengal School of Art also contributed to mainstreaming of the rural area of India. Now, this is a question from world history. The scramble for Africa was less about African realities, more about shifting geopolitical tensions within Europe, right? It was much less to do with what is happening in Africa. And it was more the result of the balance of power or the power politics going on in European continent, right? Okay, so scramble for Africa, culminating in Berlin Conference, resulted in rapid invasion, division, colonization of African continent by European powers, right? It was actually its extension of European balance of power. It was merely a geographical kind of theater, जहाँ पे ये खेला गया, geographical tension, rising nationalism, diplomatic maneuvers, all these things belong to Europe, and the theater was Africa, right? Okay, let's look at some examples. So Africa is a chessboard for European geopolitics, right? So realpolitik of Otto von Bismarck, German unification, Bismarck redirected French revanchism. So revanchism is to push back somebody territorially, right? So he sought to redirect what? French revanchism. French लोगों ने जो एरिया जीता था उसको फिर से उनको push back करना, right? From Rhine towards Africa. So Africa was used as a compensation, a place where you can go instead of expanding yourself in Europe, right? So Germany acquired territories like Southwest Africa, for example, right? Tanganyika. Then it was used as diplomatic bargaining chip against the British expansion. So these players, big players, were using Africa as a bargaining chip, as bargaining weight. If I am taking something in Europe, I'll give you something in Africa as compensation. Or in Africa, we would divide the territory, right? So it was used as a bargaining chip by the great powers of Europe. So we need to understand this. It was more of a game of European balance of power being played out in Africa. That is called scramble for Africa. British obsession with strategic dominance. That was another important dimension, right? Britain was quite dependent on Suez Canal, from where it could have access to India and Indian Ocean, right? So they wanted to control that part, and that's why occupation of Egypt was a result of it, rather a sort of an extension, right? This move upset France, and competitive rush for hinterlands on the part of France started in Africa. Britain's Cape of Cairo region was aimed at preventing rival European powers from cutting across that strategic route. Please understand, again, these two competing in Africa for their own power politics. So Africa was merely a theater, right? French status and compensatory imperialism. So when France was quite reduced, humiliated in a defeat, right? So being humiliated, defeated, France viewed colonial expansion West and North Africa as mechanism to restore its national prestige and status as a great power. So आपका कहीं भी पराजय हुआ है, आपका humiliation हुआ है, उसको यहाँ compensate करो. So it's something like that, right? Then domestic political safety valves. So severe domestic strain, right? Rise of working class radicalism, fed by the Marxism, right? Imperial expansion was weaponized as tool of social imperialism, right? And इसका मतलब है using aggressive foreign policy to manufacture national unity at home and divert public attention from domestic economic inequalities. National pride बड़ा हम बाहर क्या कर रहे हैं ये बताओ, and then domestic problems were sort of glossed over and sidelined. And there was complete disregard for African realities, paper partition without taking into consideration ethnic realities, and that's why even today you see that ethnic fault lines, conflicts in Africa, then fracturing ethnic cohesiveness, right? A forced coexistence, and the number of examples you can talk about. What Sudan, for example, Nigeria, Rwanda. So these are the regions where you see that division. Even South Sudan, North Sudan is a result of this colonial kind of, you can call it vicarial kind of imperialism, right? Number 6, examine the long-term geopolitical tremors in the modern West Asia that originated from Sykes-Picot Agreement. This agreement was essentially about caliphate. It was about caliphate. So that context of First World War, where the Turkey, which is called today Turkey, right? That caliphate was brought on the side of allied powers with the promise that their territory would be restored. But instead, France and Britain divided their territory among themselves, and making Russia also party to that entire division, right? So what we see as part of this agreement is this one. So a French zone was created with Syria and Lebanon, right? And British zone was created, Iraq, Jordan, Palestine. All these divisions did not pay attention to ethnicity. So, this was artificially removed from Syria, right? Kurds had no place, and Iraq and Iran as well became sort of a melting pot where number of ethnicities came. And we see this region precisely, the unstable region today. And you can see the consequences. So long-term geopolitical tremors, you are seeing that even today for that matter, right? So artificial statehood, chronic internal instability, Sunni Arabs, Kurds, Shia Arabs, right? Shia Sunni struggle between Saudi Arabia, Iran, and all this being clubbed in Iraq, right? So Iraq became a crucible of this conflict. So sectarian polarization, authoritarian rule, weaponization of sectarian identity, right? Lebanon's confessional system, France carved Lebanon out of Syria to create Christian majority enclave. And it promoted minority Assad regime. And what is happening in Syria, we know that very well. And then Lebanese civil war. So all these things today are nothing but the long-term tremors of what that Sykes-Picot Agreement did with this region, right? Okay, so Kurdish statelessness and transnational conflict. Already we have that Iraqi Kurdistan as autonomous region in Iraq, right? Then rise of transnational violent non-state actors. We know them very well. Islamic State is an example. And Islamic State, ISIS, clearly stated that we are looking forward to the end of Sykes-Picot system. So they know it. This is the system which has spoiled us. They want to end it. So non-state actors coming in, all these things are nothing but the repercussions of what colonial powers did. So persistent sovereign legitimacy deficit in these regions is because of what has happened at that time. Artificial borders without any kind of sense of nationality. States were created and there is legitimacy crisis in these states. Okay, so next question. The peasant awakening seen in 1930s in India was largely a result of combination of particular economic, political developments of that period. I won't go into details of all those things. I would explain that briefly. So peasant awakening of 1930s. Please understand, even before 20th century, in 19th century, there were peasant revolts, right? What they lacked was class consciousness. They lacked class consciousness. This was brought by the left parties, which emerged in the decade of 1920s. And that class consciousness eventually made peasants go for organized kind of struggle for the interest of their entire class. And that's how you see in 1934, if I'm not wrong, All India Kisan Sabha coming up. So question is on that. So different factors which contributed to peasant awakening in 30s were Great Depression, right? Price crash, debt trap. Then political catalyst was civil disobedience movement, right? Then provincial elections and Congress ministries. So all these factors contribute. I have somewhere mentioned that communist aspect as well, right? Left-wing elements and communist rather class consciousness created by communists. All these things contributed to what? The awareness of peasants. Okay. The communal award was seen not only as attack on national unity. Please understand, was seen by the people at that time not only as attack on national unity, but also inimical, dangerous to interest of depressed classes. जो लोग मांग रहे हैं उनके लिए भी वो ठीक नहीं है. Those who are demanding, it is not good for them as well, right? So highlight how Pune Pact sought to address some concerns in this regard. There are two questions here. One, we have to explain it was not only attack on national unity, but it was even detrimental to the depressed classes. Simple argument is already Muslims, Christians, Sikhs, Anglo-Indians were given separate electorate. And the concept of separate electorate divides people, voters, right? They are only voting to the person of their community. That creates divides. Unity is sought to be damaged through separate electorate, which is called Morley-Minto device. And Gandhi sought to prevent another division. So far, the divisions were based on community, Muslim community, Christian community, Sikh community, right? And now within Hindu community, another divide was sought to be created by Ramsay MacDonald, the British Prime Minister at that time, right? So Gandhi wanted to avoid that division, and that's why he opposed separate electorates for depressed classes. Please understand, there's a misunderstanding that Gandhi opposed only separate electorate for depressed classes. That is not true, because Gandhi was in Africa when separate electorate was given to Muslims in 1909. And there was no connectivity as such where you would immediately know that this is happening. Secondly, by the time Gandhi came to India, already Muslims were given separate electorate, and his stand about separate electorate was clear in Second Roundtable Conference. He opposed separate electorate in principle. Nobody should be given separate electorate, right? So his opposition was based on this. That is one aspect, national unity. Second was, Gandhi believed that it is inimical to depressed classes. That would isolate them. That would not mainstream them. And that's why it is not good for their development as well. That was his argument. And then how Pune Pact resolved it? Instead of separate electorate, right, more seats were given to depressed classes through reserved seats. Right? Those details are given in this answer. You can go through it. So all these things are abandonment of separate electorate, substantial increase in representation, central legislative quota was 18%, two-tier voting safeguards were given, primary elections to decide the members, and then actual election, right? And administrative educational backing was given, right? Grants and all that, okay. Evaluate indispensable contributions of Northeast leaders in narrative of India's struggle for independence. This is one potent area as far as mains is concerned this year, because Northeast is in news because of Manipur violence, and you should prepare answer on this, right? So narrative of India's freedom struggle was dominated by mainstream mainland accounts. Mostly we hear contributors from mainland. We don't hear much about leaders from northeast, right? Examples are given here. You can see it. We'll quickly go through it. So pioneers of armed resistance sovereignty, Utirat Singh Saim, right? Khasi war जिन्होंने lead किया था. Then Tikendrajit Singh, Manipur में, he led the Manipuri army in that Manipur war of 1891, and then ये दोनों martyr हुए. Then Pauna Brajbashi, Battle of Khonjom, right? And defining moment of armed resistance British colonial forces in the region, that is Manipur region. Then गांधी मास मूवमेंट के साथ जो जुड़े गोपीनाथ बरदुलाई, कांग्रेस को इंस्टीट्यूलाइज किया, सीडीएम में थे. देन कनकलता बरुआ इन क्विट इंडिया मूवमेंट, 17-year-old रिवोल्यूशनरी महिला थी, ये मार्टियर हुई. देन भोगेश्वरी फुकनानी, 60-year-old martyr, she was called like that, right? These are examples. Then subaltern reformist resistance, Hypo Jadnang, right? That is an example. Hiraka movement. And another example from Hiraka movement is this one, Rani Gaidrilu. Collaboration with Indian National Army, Mairanga's flashpoint. This is where INA entered, right? And local people supported INA in terms of logistics. So that has to be also recognized, right? So these are the examples of what? Participation from Northeast, right? Next question. British utilized legislative curbs on press as a strategic tool to stifle burgeoning nationalist ideology. I told you, British imperial ideology had enslaved us both territorially as well as intellectually. It was important to counter that intellectual hegemony. And the most important instrument at that time was press. Yes, no doubt there were other instruments as well, जैसे कि theater है, novels है, right? Number of types of writings, but this was an important media at that time, press, right? Elaborate on the evolution of press censorship. The question is not on Indian press per se. It is on the evolution of press censorship. So different important, I would say milestones बोलना मुश्किल होगा, but important acts which sought to curb Indian press. So पहला था Censorship Act 1799, Lord Wellesley during Anglo-Mysore War. दूसरा Licensing Regulations 1823 by John Adams, right? So to suppress Ram Mohan Roy's Mirat-ul-Akhbar को suppress करने के लिए, he was creating awareness among people, right? Then the liberal phase, जहाँ पे उसको थोड़ा कम कर दिया गया. So liberator of Indian press is called Charles Metcalfe. उसको बोलते हैं Metcalfe Act 1835. He tried to reduce, but again vernacular crackdown, crushing radical anti-colonialism in the aftermath of revolt of 1857, right? Then you can see that example of Licensing Act 57, and the most defamed act which sought to curb Indian press like anything, that was Vernacular Press Act, right, of 1878 under Lord Lytton. It is called Gagging Act, right? So these are the examples. You are supposed to explain them briefly in this answer, right? Then suppression of extremism, revolutionary trends during Swadeshi movement. These are the acts. And we always say, this act brought curbs, and this act virtually sought to revive Vernacular Press Act. So it revived the worst features of Vernacular Press Act. And the nationalist counter strategy for this. So subtle creative writing, strategic dual personas. एक एग्जांपल मैं आपको देता हूँ. आपने नाम बदल करके लिखना हो, या फिर अमृत बाजार पत्रिका, जब वो वर्नैक्युलर प्रेस एक्ट आया, इट वाज अ एक्ट टू सप्रेस वर्नैक्युलर प्रेस. अमृत बाजार पत्रिका ओवरनाइट, रातों रात वो इंग्लिश बना. इट स्टार्टेड इंग्लिश प्रेस, सेम व्यूज इन इंग्लिश, एंड बिकॉज वर्नैक्युलर प्रेस एक्ट डिड नॉट अप्लाई टू इंग्लिश प्रेस, दे फाउंड एन एस्केप. So nationalists were clever enough to find escapes, right, from sections like section 124A, that was sedition section at that time, right? Okay. Question number 11. Now these are 20 markers. The architecture of Pallav kingdom has distinctive style consist of cave temples, monolithic temples and structural temples. Question ही बता रहा है आपको, आपने क्या explain करना है. Cave temples, monolithic rock cut temples like Rath at that time जो create किए गए थे, and then structural temples, right? तो वो यहाँ पे एक्सप्लेन किया गया. You can see it here. 3 distinctive stylistic phases. Cave temples, rock cut phase. So Mahendravarman I के under Mahendravarman I, who was the king, right? So key features क्या है वो लिखे हुए हैं. Mandapas, simplicity, massive proportions of the temples, and most important feature was pillared halls, right? Example, sorry, features उसके Mahendravarman के architecture के towering superstructure, that is शिखर. Examples क्या है? Mandapattu and Mahendravadi and Trichy. यहाँ के temples you can clearly see, right? Okay. Cave temples. Monolithic temples. Mamalla phase. Narasimhavarman I, Mamalla. तो उसके नाम से वो Mamalla phase बोला गया उसको, right? So freestanding structures out of single independent boulder. Suppose ये rock है ऐसा, उसको ऊपर से carve करते आना है. You start carving from the top, right? And you create a massive temple, right? Like this. So virtually you are removing this part and this becomes a freestanding open to sky kind of a temple. Cave में क्या होता है? This is a massive rock, right? और उसके अंदर एक cave है और cave में आपने कुछ बना. That's different story. That is called cave architecture. This is entire rock carved into a single monolithic temple, right? This is called a structural monolithic temple, right? Okay. Freestanding monolithic temple. Structural अलग है, sorry. Structural is that you built it. आप देखो ऊपर से नीचे तक carve out करना, that is monolithic temple, freestanding. Structural is you build block by block from bottom up. That is called structural kind of temples or buildings, right? Okay, so that is second phase. Examples are given. Pancharathas. Structural temples. Rajasiha and Nandivarman phases. ये kings है. Rajasiha, Narasimhavarman II, इसको बोला जाता है final phase by using dressed stone blocks to build independent structure. Blocks use करके building बनाना. That is the third phase, right? Examples दिए हुए. Shore temple is an example. Then Kailasnath temple of Kanchipuram. Please understand, Kanchipuram का Kailasnath temple ये पल्लव आर्किटेक्चर का है. और जो कैलाशनाथ टेम्पल एलोरा में है दैट इज ऑफ राष्ट्रकूटास, राइट? ओके. नेक्स्ट क्वेश्चन. द टीचिंग्स ऑफ वैदिक पीरियड प्रोवाइडेड फाउंडेशनल फ्रेमवर्क फॉर इंडियन फिलोसॉफी, बट इट वाज श्रमण ट्रेडिशन दैट इंट्रोड्यूस्ड कॉन्सेप्ट ऑफ रेडिकल सोशल इक्वालिटी. क्रिटिकली एग्जामिन. क्या बोला गया? क्रिटिकली एग्जामिन. ओके. नाउ couple of things. One, teachings of Vedic period providing foundational framework for Indian, that is right, and that is why ancient Indian philosophy is grouped into two parts. It is grouped into two parts: orthodox and unorthodox. Orthodox and unorthodox. Orthodox में कौन से आते हैं मैं बताता हूं आपको, and unorthodox, right? Okay. Orthodox में you have those Shad Darshan, 6 schools of philosophy, right? आप जानते होंगे सांख्य, योग, वैशेषिक, न्याय, मीमांसा, वेदांत, right? Okay. So 6 schools of philosophy. Because all those 6 schools are based on Vedic philosophy, it is right that Vedic period provided foundational framework for Indian philosophy. दूसरी बात, ये जो अनऑर्थोडॉक्स है ना, उसमें 3 नाम आते हैं, जैन, बुद्धिस्ट एंड चारवाक. बाकी और भी हैं 3 मेजर. All of them rejected Vedic authority, so they are also coming in reaction to, in response to Vedic philosophy. That is why the first statement is right, that teachings of Vedic period provided foundation framework for Indian philosophy. लेकिन उसमें फिर श्रमण ट्रेडिशन का एक डिस्टिंक्ट कॉन्ट्रीब्यूशन है. क्या कॉन्ट्रीब्यूशन है? Vedic philosophy and the philosophies which emerged on the basis of it were never egalitarian. Those are based on inequality, inherent inequality. So सोशल इक्वालिटी की बात अगर किसी ने की है तो श्रमण ट्रेडिशन है, उसमें ये सब बात. नाउ प्लीज अंडरस्टैंड, द क्वेश्चन इज क्रिटिकली एग्जामिन. दैट मीन्स यू हैव टू अंडरस्टैंड वेदर इट वाज ट्रूली रेडिकल और नॉट. वो सही में रेडिकल था कि नहीं था. ठीक है, क्या बोला गया? रेडिकल सोशल इक्वालिटी. प्लीज अंडरस्टैंड, राइट? अब अगर सोशल इक्वालिटी की बात हो रही है तो उसमें वर्ण, कास्ट, क्लास इसकी बात होगी और जेंडर, दोनों के बारे में लिखो. इन बोथ दिस केसेस, फॉर एग्जाम्पल, Jainism accepted Varna system and gave right of salvation, mukti, to all. हिंदुइज्म डिड नॉट गिव राइट टू सॉल्वेशन टू शूद्र, इन्होंने सभी को दिया। मतलब मुक्ति में, सॉल्वेशन में इक्वालिटी है, रियल लाइफ में नहीं। So that is not radical kind of equality, right? Though Jainism was much better as compared to Vedic philosophy in terms of social equality, it wasn't that radical, right? So इसलिए लिखा गया है, however, how radical it was needs to be examined. Even in case of gender equality, like Vedic and later on that Puranic philosophy, which is based on Vedic philosophy, women were not given right to salvation, neither by Vedic philosophy, nor by Jainism, nor by Buddhism. Though Buddhism accepted the concept of nirvana to women, it essentially went through that part, which also Vedic philosophy underlined. A woman has to be reborn as a man first, and then she can get liberation through that, something of that kind, right? So radical उतना नहीं था. It was radical given the context of old times. जिस समय में किया गया वहाँ पे radical था, but in general it was not that radical, right? But it was much more egalitarian as compared to Vedic philosophy. तो सारी चीजें दी गई, Vedic teachings, cosmic order, कर्म, concept of Ruth, कर्म संसार, core philosophy of monism, that is Advait, right? Then structural flaw क्या है उसमें, वर्ण system में structural flaw deeply hierarchical है, right? And then how Shraman tradition sought to counter rejection of वर्ण by Buddhism, birth based hierarchy को reject कर दिया, right? Democratization of spiritual space जहाँ पे सभी को लाया गया, even those who were called untouchables were also allowed to enter Buddhist Sangh. It worked on democratic lines, right? By taking decisions based on majority. You can see it here. Upalia, Barber, Sunit, scavengers were considered untouchable. Attained status of highly revered Arhat, enlightened beings, right? Example दिया. Gender inclusivity. इसमें है, there is no doubt about that. Buddhism gave much more spiritual role, agency to women. Bhikkhuni Sangh था, लेकिन Bhikkhuni Sangh was subordinate to Bhikkhu Sangh, right? Then linguistic democracy, Ardhamagdi Prakrit, dismantled Pali, dismantled the hegemony of Sanskrit as far as religious literature is concerned. So all these things can be put forth, and then limitations, spiritual versus temporal equality. आप spiritual equality बोलते हो, यहाँ की नहीं, reality, right? And then gender asymmetry भी उसमें था. I have talked about that, right? Okay. Mughal paintings represent sophisticated blend of Persian finesse and Indian naturalism, no doubt about that. To what extent did this fusion influence later Rajput and Pahadi schools of art? See, briefly आपको explain करना है, briefly, very briefly, कि मुगल किस तरह से इसका फ्यूजन करते हैं, पर्शियन फाइनेस एंड इंडियन नेशनलिज्म, एंड देन उसका इम्पैक्ट कैसा रहा बाकी स्कूल्स ऑफ पेंटिंग्स के ऊपर, राइट? ओके, सो इट हैज बीन explained here briefly how it was combination of delicate calligraphic fineness of Persian art and the vibrant naturalism of Indian traditions, and then how it impacted different schools. So Mewar, Marwar, Rajput schools in general. So it absorbed Mughal elements, right? It absorbed Mughal elements, no doubt about that. Elegant, courtly aesthetic. Technique and realism, you can see that adoption. Linear perspective, three-quarter profiles, realistic individual portraits. These were all Mughal elements which were brought, right? Refinement of miniature lineage, delicate ultra-fine brushwork was borrowed. Kishangarh masterpiece, iconic painting, Bani Thani ka, elongated features, ethereal grace of late Mughal aesthetic ideals can be seen here. ये सब बोरो किया, इसमें कोई डाउट नहीं है, राइट? पहाड़ी स्कूल के ऊपर भी आपको इन्फ्लुएंस देखने को मिलता है. बसोली स्कूल, फ्योर्स, इंटेंस कलर्स वगैरह वगैरह, ऑल दोस फीचर्स आर गिवन, and that infusion of naturalism, right? So different elements are being mentioned here, but now the question is to what extent of fusion. So synthesis versus retention of autonomy. फीचर्स लिए थे, सब्जेक्ट मैटर नहीं लिया था, कुछ हद तक सब्जेक्ट मैटर, जैसे कि मुगल्स वे प्राइमरली फोकस्ड ऑन राजा का लाइफ दिखाना. सो देयर बाय देयर सेक्युलर पेंटिंग्स, राइट? यहाँ पे भक्ति मूवमेंट के पिक्चर्स, महाभारत रामायण की पिक्चर्स, तो उस थीम को नहीं बदला गया था, राइट? सो मुगल पर्शियन इनकाउंटर, नॉट अ ब्लाइंड इमिटेशन, राइट? रिटेन्ड डीप आइडियोलॉजिकल ऑटोनॉमी, राइट? सो थियोलॉजिकल शिफ्ट, सेक्युलर वर्सेस सैक्रेड. Mughal art was fundamentally secular, historical, and self-glorifying, right? Whereas Rajput Pahadi schools were sacred, lyrical, and devotional themes. So theme में कोई बदलाव नहीं है, उन्होंने ideological autonomy कायम रखी, right? Then emotionalism over documentation, right? Mughal naturalism was strictly observational and clinical. राजा है, वो कहीं पे गया किसको मिलने के लिए, उसको दिखाना पेंटिंग में, उसके दरबार का पेंटिंग दिखाना, ऑब्जर्वेशन से, राइट? एंड राजपूत पार्टी स्कूल्स दे मोर इनटू इमोशनल सिंबॉलिक पर्पस, जहाँ पे सिंबलाइज पैशन, राइट? रंगमाल पेंटिंग्स, मानसून लाइटनिंग, ये सारी चीज. नेचुरलिज्म में भी कुछ एक डिफरेंस आपको देखने को मिलता है. सो नो डाउट देयर वाज व्हाट influence, but to what extent? To the extent of adopting some features. It did not really dilute its themes or ideological autonomy, right? Given the specific nature character of British colonial state, the Indian national movement gradually evolved its strategy and tactics over course of time. Analyze. थोड़ा simple question है, but आपने ठीक तरीके से लिखना चाहिए in order to get good marks, right? So specific nature character of the British colonial state कैसा था? Semi-hegemonic, constitutionalist, legally defensive, and exploitative. प्लीज अंडरस्टैंड, मैं कई बार ये क्लास में मजाक में बोलता हूं, ये अन्याय भी लीगली करते थे. ब्रिटिश अन्याय भी लीगली करते थे, वो एक्सप्लॉइट भी लीगली करते, लॉ बना करके एक्सप्लॉइट करना. सो दे वेर कॉन्स्टिट्यूशनलिस्ट, नो डाउट अबाउट दैट. दे वेर लीगल, बट वेर देयर कॉन्स्टिट्यूशनल लॉ वेर लेजिटिमेट? नो. वेर द रैशनल? नो. वेर द इगैलिटेरियन? नो. वेर द डेवलपमेंटल? नो. दैट्स अ डिफरेंट स्टोरी. दे वर एक्सप्लॉइटेड. ये नेचर जब समझ में आया ग्रेजुअली, स्टेज वाइज, you see change in methods. So moderates initially believed that British are here for our benefit. They are modernizing us, right? They are civilizing us. And that's why they use the methods of petition, prayer, you know that very well, protest, 3 Ps. They believed in essential goodness of British rule, and they tried to just showcase, rather expose the negatives of British rule with the hope that British would rectify them, right? But when we understood that British are not going to rectify anything, the biggest attempt on the part of moderates to expose the negative aspects of British with the hope that the British would rectify them was drain theory. इनको लगा कि हम बोलेंगे कि एक्सप्लॉइट कर रहा है ब्रिटिश रूल तो रोक देंगे. That was their very, I would say, naive kind of hope on their part, despite being great intellectuals, moderates, right? But they did expose British rule, its exploitative character. उसका फायदा हुआ नेक्स्ट स्टेज में. नाउ हैविंग अंडरस्टूड दैट द ब्रिटिश आर हियर टू एक्सप्लॉइट, दे आर नॉट गोइंग टू चेंज, हैविंग अंडरस्टूड ट्रू नेचर ऑफ ब्रिटिश रूल, इन्होंने अलग मेथड शुरू किया, राइट? क्या कर रहा है ब्रिटिश रूल? हमको एक्सप्लॉइट कर रहा है इकोनॉमिकली. कैसे एक्सप्लॉइट कर रहा है? अपनी चीजें बेच करके. ओके, विल बायकॉट इट एंड हम अपनी चीजें खरीदेंगे. सो स्वदेशी एंड बायकॉट बिकेम द मोस्ट इंपॉर्टेंट वेपन्स, राइट? एंड नेशनल एजुकेशन, हमारा अपना एजुकेशन. सो स्वदेशी एंड बायकॉट वाज अ काउंटर टू exploitative colonial rule. जैसा nature वैसे methods, right? Strategic outcome, passive resistance through agitations. That is what we see, right? Passive resistance through agitations, right? Okay. Gandhian era, dismantling the semi-hegemonic state. Mahatma Gandhi recognized British state maintained power not just through bullets, but through the consent of the ruled. हमने consent दिया इसलिए उन्हें रूल किया. मैं क्लास में बोलता हूं कि हमने ब्रिटिश राज ढोया है. वी कैरीड ब्रिटिश रूल ऑन आवर शोल्डर्स, राइट? मैं हमेशा ये बोलता हूं विदाउट एनी काइंड ऑफ द माल इंटेंशन टू डैमेज रेपुटेशन ऑफ मंगल पांडे. मंगल पांडे ने अंग्रेजों के ऊपर गोली चलाई रिवोल्ट ऑफ 1857 में. उसके पहले वो किसके ऊपर गोलियां चला रहे थे? हमारे अपने लोगों के ऊपर. मंगल पांडे इज एन एग्जाम्पल. ब्रिटिश रूल्ड अस यूजिंग ब्रिटिश इंडियन आर्मी, जिसमें मेजॉरिटी इंडियंस थे. कई सारे जमींदार, कई सारे राजा लोग ब्रिटिशों को लॉयल थे. सो वी नीड टू अंडरस्टैंड दिस. हमारा कंसेंट है इसलिए रूल कर रहे हैं. एंड गांधी वांटेड टू एंड दैट कंसेंट. ही वांटेड टू एंड दैट सेमी हेजेमोनिक स्टेट बेस्ड ऑन दैट कंसेंट, राइट? ओके. सो अब उनको लगा कि इफ वी डू इट इन अ नॉन वायलेंट मैनर, और अगर वो हमारे खिलाफ वायलेंस यूज करते हैं, तो लोगों के मन में जो उसका मोरल अथॉरिटी है ब्रिटिश रूल को खत्म हो जाए. It will end. So use non-violent methods, fight against injustice, and despite we being non-violent, when they would use the violence, तो उनका खुद का आर्गुमेंट खत्म हो जाएगा कि हम यहाँ पे आपको ठीक करने के लिए आए, नहीं आप हमको मारने आए. And then gradually people would understand the evil aspect of British rule and they would participate in large numbers. And that legitimacy would be finished, right? That was Gandhian kind of deeper thought. So non-violent satyagraha as a structural trap for the British rule. वो hegemony trap था वो. आप जिस चीज का hegemony लेकर के आए हैं, उस hegemony के थ्रू हमारा जो consent आपने लिया है, उस consent को ही खत्म कर देंगे और आप ही को trap कर देंगे, right? Then constructive work, another aspect. जब movement नहीं चल रहा है, तो समाज में जाकर के नॉन वायलेंस, अहिंसा और ट्रूथ ये इनकलकेट कराओ कि किसी भी हालत में इवन इफ द अदर पार्टी दैट इज ब्रिटिश यूज वायलेंस अगेंस्ट अस, वी आर नॉट गोइंग टू यूज वायलेंस बिकॉज द मोमेंट इफ वी यूज वायलेंस दे गेट अ रीजन टू सप्रेस अस, दैट टू जस्टिफाइड रीजन. यू आर वायलेंट एंड वी हैव टू सप्रेस. सो इफ यू protest, if you agitate, if you get into movement in a non-violent manner, you can erode the legitimacy of British rule. So that method he used, right? And the last stage, 40s में final strike against war-weary state. अब nature क्या बन गया? Britain was exhausted in Second World War, so we said get lost. हमारी भाषा में quit India, right? So quit India movement, do or die. That method changed because of the change in nature of state. So we have answered that question: how changing nature brought change in the methods, tactics, right? Why did Cripps mission fail to find favor with major political parties in India despite offering more concession than August offer? अलग-अलग parties ने अलग-अलग कारणों की वजह से उसको reject किया. So why Congress rejected? Because all the promises were post-war promises and Congress was looking forward to real transfer of power. Independence चाहिए. Cripps proposal क्या बोल रहा है? After war डोमिनेंस स्टेटस देंगे, एग्जीक्यूटिव काउंसिल सभी आपका बनेगा वगैरह वगैरह, राइट? सो गांधी कॉल्ड इट पोस्ट डेटेड चेक. सो दिस इज वन रीजन. देन absence of immediate cabinet responsibility. You are not talking about immediate transfer of power, you're talking about post war promises. That is not going to work. So Nehru remarked that they were being ordered nothing more than the position of glorified orderly kind of a thing. You would maintain the order, हमको glorify करेंगे, which is of no use. Then blueprint of balkanization. This was another reason why Congress rejected, because of the non-acceding clause, which allowed Indian states to prefer to be away from this arrangement. Just a moment, I think there is some problem. Okay, so that non-accession clause was problematic. Why was it problematic? It was problematic because if Indian states do not accede and they're allowed to retain autonomy and go for their own arrangements, that would create multiple states in India, right? So balkanization of India. Okay, so on that ground as well, Congress rejected Cripps proposal. Just a moment. Okay, we talked about this. Question number 15th, I think. Yes. So blueprint for balkanization. That was another reason. Then undemocratic representation for princely states, right? They were given undemocratic kind of representation because they were nominating the people and not electing them. Reasons for Muslim League to reject it, because there was no explicit creation of Pakistan and they said that the assembly mechanism is flawed. We don't want one assembly, we want two assemblies for two nations. That's why they rejected. Other parties, Hindu Mahasabha liberals opposed because of the non-accession clause that would create multiple states, right? Divisible ho jayega India. Depressed classes, Ambedkar clearly said that opt-out clause and lack of explicit constitutional safeguards would leave them at the mercy of caste Hindu majorities in a fragmented subcontinent. So we are being left at the mercy of caste Hindu majority. So that was the objection of depressed classes through Ambedkar, right? So यहाँ पे एक आपके लिए दिया हुआ है table, you can go through that to understand how it was different from August offer, right? Okay. The revolt of 1857 led not to the downfall but the consolidation of British Empire in India. In this context, bring out changes in administrative structure and policies. दो चीजें हैं, structure बदला, company rule खत्म हुआ, court of directors was replaced by court of directors and board of control was replaced by what is called India office. इसमें एक secretary of state जो ब्रिटिश कैबिनेट का हिस्सा होगा, उसको असिस्ट करने के लिए इंडिया ऑफिस. एंड इंडिया में this was government in London, and in India Governor General was called Viceroy, who is the Vice Royalty, that is crown का representative in India, right? बाकी structure remains same in India. जो भी changes किए गए यहाँ पे किए गए. Policies की बात की जाए तो number of things were followed. You can see it here. One, ये मिलिट्री पॉलिसी बदल गया, इंडियन यूरोपियंस का रेशियो बदला गया, राइट. मोनोपोली और स्ट्रेटेजिक आर्म्स, मार्शल रेस का कॉन्सेप्ट, watertight compartmentalized so that regiments would remain fragmented, right. Colonial policies, appeasement of princely states, revolt primarily इन्होंने किया था, तो इनको खुश रखो. Alliance with feudal elements, जमींदार ने भी revolt किया था, जमींदार को favorite children, they became favorite children of imperialism, right. Policy change. Then more importantly, policy of social non-intervention. Lord Bentinck से जो शुरू हो गया था ना social intervention through abolition of sati up to what Religious Disabilities Act, ये सारी चीजें बंद करनी है. इंडियन लोगों को सुधारने की कोशिश मत करो, उनको इग्नोरेंस में रखो और एक्सप्लॉइट करो. इफ यू ट्राई टू रिफॉर्म देम सोशली, दे रिएक्ट अगेंस्ट अस, सो स्टॉप दिस. एंड देन फैनिंग कम्युनल क्लीवेजेस, सो पॉलिसी ऑफ डिवाइड एंड रूल. सो दीज वे चेंजेस इन द पॉलिसी, राइट. Assess complexities and conflicting ideologies involved in the post-independence efforts to integrate tribal communities into Indian mainstream. बड़ा इंटरेस्टिंग सवाल है, क्या क्या फिलोसॉफीज ट्राई किए गए. देखो, एक है आइसोलेशनिस्ट अप्रोच. व्हाट इज द कोर फिलोसॉफी? अगर ट्राइबल्स कम इन कॉन्टैक्ट विद मॉडर्न सिविलाइजेशन, दे वुड बी वॉश्ड आउट, देयर कल्चर वुड बी वॉश्ड आउट. सो कल्चरल डिग्रेडेशन होगा, एक्सप्लॉयटेशन होगा, उनके लिए वो साइकोलॉजिकल ट्रॉमा होगा. सो लीव देम एट इन देयर ओन प्लेस. आइसोलेशनिस्ट अप्रोच, राइट. स्ट्रेटेजी, एडवोकेट फॉर कीपिंग ट्राइबल एरियाज आइसोलेटेड इन प्रोटेक्टेड एनक्लेव्स, effectively treating them as national parks to preserve their pristine culture from the voices of market capitalism. दूसरा, assimilationist approach. क्या है philosophy? They view tribals not as distinct ethnic groups but as backward Hindus. So bring them into Hinduism, assimilate them, right? Strategy, advocate for rapid, complete absorption of communities into mainstream socio-economic structure, language, कल्चरल प्रैक्टिसेस. ये दो एक्सट्रीम थे, रेडिकल. नेहरूज मिडिल पाथ, ट्राइबल पंचशील. सो कोर फिलोसॉफी रिजेक्टेड बोथ एब्सोल्यूट आइसोलेशन एंड assimilation, aggressive assimilation. It sought a synthesis that allowed modern development to reach tribal communities without eroding their cultural core. And this was put into Article 371. A, B, C जो अलग अलग ट्राइबल एरियाज के लिए दिया गया, पंचशील नेहरू का नीचे दिया हुआ. You can go through it. So these are the different philosophies, right? अब दूसरा aspect, complexities in practical implementation. क्या हुआ, क्या क्या complexities है आप जानते हो वैसे. This paradox, development, displacement. If you go for development, it leads to displacement of tribal communities. अगर mines exploit करने तो पड़ेगी development के लिए, which are in tribal zone, तो उनको displace करना पड़ेगा. कोई dam बनाना है, so development displacement kind of paradox. दूसरा, land and forest rights क्राइसिस. कॉलोनियल स्टेट ने, राइट, फॉरेस्ट को कमर्शलाइज कर दिया था एंड ट्रेडिशनल ट्राइबल यूसेज काफी हद तक रेस्ट्रिक्ट कर दिया था. सो पोस्ट इंडिपेंडेंस कॉन्स्टिट्यूशन सेफगार्ड दिए, आर्टिकल 371 एंड अदर आर्टिकल्स, राइट. बट स्टेट का डोमिनेशन रहा किसके ऊपर? फॉरेस्ट रिसोर्सेज के ऊपर. सो कम्युनिटी ओनरशिप, राइट, जुम कल्टिवेशन clashed directly with modern bureaucratic individual and titles, leaving tribals vulnerable to land alienation by non-tribals, even in independent India. Constitutional design versus bureaucratic reality. So Constitution created 5th and 6th schedules to provide administrative autonomy through Tribes Advisory Council, Autonomous District Council. लेकिन इन bodies में जो bureaucrats है, they dominated in terms of what? Funds, political teeth, and administrative power. So that is one conflict. Then cultural alienation, identity anxieties. Introduction of formal education system often ignored tribal languages, imposing state level dominant languages as media of instruction. तो वो भी एक तरह से उनके लिए identity crisis बना, and that identity anxiety increased. So these are different aspects of the question regarding the problem of tribals. Question number 18, 19, 20 are on world history. ये क्या सवाल है? Stating the reasons of outbreak of Vietnam War. पहला aspect क्या है सवाल का? और the first aspect, you are supposed to give the reasons of Vietnam War. Discuss how it became a major theater of Cold War. ये known case है. It's a known case, right? What started as anti-colonial, French colonialism था वियतनाम में. What started as anti-colonial liberation, national liberation war, was sort of dragged into, converted into Cold War politics, proxy war between US and USSR. हाँ, उसके इवेंट सारे दिए हुए हैं, यू कैन गो थ्रू इट. सो which was localized anti-colonial war of national liberation against French rule, evolved into prolonged proxy conflict, right? So reasons for outbreak, reasons क्या है quickly? Collapse of French colonialism and Geneva Accords. Geneva Accords ने 17 parallel बना दिया, right? तो वियतनाम पार्टीशन हो गया नॉर्थ और साउथ में. दैट इज प्रॉब्लमैटिक. फर्स्ट रीजन, राइट? देन नॉर्थ वियतनाम कम्युनिस्ट, साउथ वियतनाम प्रो वेस्टर्न स्टेट, राइट? जो ये हो ची मिन के अंडर था उसको वियत मिन बोलते हैं, और ये एंटी कम्युनिस्ट लीडरशिप दिन दियम, राइट, उनके अंडर. फेलियर ऑफ मैंडेटरी नेशनल इलेक्शन, इलेक्शन लेने थे वो डीम ने नहीं बोल दिया, एंड व्हेन इट इज रिजेक्टेड तो लोगों का सपोर्ट उसको नहीं मिलेगा, एंगर बढ़ेगा. सो इलेक्शन वे नॉट कंडक्टेड, जो मैंडेट किया गया था. राइज ऑफ नेशनल लिबरेशन फ्रंट एज ए रिजल्ट ऑफ इट. सो डीएम्स रिप्रेसिव एंटी बुद्धिस्ट एंड करप्ट गवर्नेंस, उसके खिलाफ वियत कांग्रेस ने गोरिल्ला कैंपेन शुरू किया टू ओवरथ्रो सदर्न रिजिम. इसको सपोर्ट किया यूएस ने और इनको सपोर्ट किया यूएसएसआर ने. सो दैट्स हाउ दैट वाज कन्वर्टेड इनटू a Cold War theater, right? Legacy of first Indo-China war, that is another reason why it happened. Viet Minh fought to explain French colonial rule. Viet Minh fought, right? French were defeated. फिर भी Western powers were deeply reluctant to cede entire region to communist administration, and this embroiled Vietnam into what is called North versus South, communist versus Western imperialist kind of South, जहाँ पे वेस्टर्न इंपीरियलिज्म का प्रभाव आप दे सकते हो. देन एग्रेसिव अग्रेन अपराइजिंग्स एंड बकस्ट काउंटर रिफॉर्म्स इन साउथ. डीएम रिजिम ने जो प्रॉमिस किया गया था वो नहीं किया. इनफैक्ट जो रिफॉर्म्स पहले किए गए थे उसको रिवर्स कर दिया और अब्सेंटी लैंडलॉर्ड्स को लैंड दे दिया. सो एंगर ऑफ पीजेंट्स वाज कैपिटलाइज्ड बाय द नॉर्थ, दैट इज कम्युनिस्ट नॉर्थ, राइट? सो वियत कांग्रेस इंसर्जेंसी को ज्वाइन कर लिया पीजेंट्री ने, राइट? एंड देन दैट वियतनाम वॉर बिकेम कोल्ड वॉर थिएटर, राइट? सो अमेरिकन डोमिनो थ्योरी, अगर वियतनाम कम्युनिस्टों के हाथ में चला जाता है तो बाकी स्टेट्स भी साउथ ईस्ट एशिया के उनके हाथ में जाएंगे, डोमिनो इफेक्ट होगा, ये नहीं होने देना चाहिए. देन सोवियत, सोवियत प्रॉक्सी कंपटीशन, ये दोनों भी कॉम्पीट कर रहे थे. सोवियत यूनियन प्रोवाइडेड नॉर्थ वियतनाम विद एडवांस मिलिट्री हार्डवेयर इंक्लूडिंग सरफेस टू एयर मिसाइल्स, रडार सिस्टम, जेट फाइटर्स. चाइना सप्लाइड मैसिव लॉजिस्टिकल सपोर्ट, इंडियन ट्रूप्स वगैरह वगैरह, राइट? एंड यूएस ने साउथ वियतनाम को सपोर्ट किया. सो इट बिकेम थिएटर ऑफ कोल्ड वॉर. Containment doctrine versus national liberation. Communists were talking about national liberation, right, from the Western capitalist imperialism, whereas US was talking about containing expanse of Soviet communism. Soviet communism के expansion को रोकना, right? So ये भी उसका एक aspect है. Question number 19. October Revolution was a direct consequence of provisional government's inability to resolve the crisis of February Revolution. इसको एग्जामिन करने के लिए बोला है. सो अक्टूबर रिवोल्यूशन, उसका कॉन्सिक्वेंस था कि फेब्रुअरी रिवोल्यूशन वो नहीं कर पाया जो उससे एक्सपेक्टेड था. नंबर 1. नंबर 2, ऑल्सो डिस्कस कॉन्सिक्वेंसेस ऑफ अक्टूबर रिवोल्यूशन फॉर रशिया एंड द वर्ल्ड. उसकी कॉन्सिक्वेंसेस क्या रहे? लेट अस गो थ्रू इट क्विकली. सो फेब्रुअरी रिवोल्यूशन, राइट, डिसमेंटल्ड द सेंचुरीज ओल्ड रोमानोव ऑटोक्रेसी एंड प्रोविजनल गवर्नमेंट बनाया गया, लेकिन इट प्रूव्ड स्ट्रक्चरली वीक, पॉलिटिकली ब्लाइंड टू द डिमांड्स ऑफ द पीपल. लोगों की डिमांड को ब्लाइंड था. तो इट्स फेल्योर टू रिजॉल्व द फाउंडेशनल क्राइसिस ऑफ फेब्रुअरी, दैट इज पीस, लैंड एंड ब्रेड. पीपल वांटेड पीस एंड रशिया वाज एम्ब्रॉयल्ड इनटू फर्स्ट वर्ल्ड वॉर, राइट? दैट इज वन. लैंड, देयर वाज प्रॉब्लम ऑफ हंगर बिकॉज ऑफ इन्फ्लेशन, वॉर की वजह से जो डैमेज हुआ था वो सारी चीजें, राइट? एंड देन ब्रेड, राइट? सो सॉरी, लैंड का लैंड रिफॉर्म्स का इशू था. ब्रेड इज फूड क्राइसिस, right? This was issue of land reforms and this was the issue of hunger. तो ये इशू रिजॉल्व नहीं कर पाए फेब्रुअरी रिवोल्यूशन, इसलिए अक्टूबर रिवोल्यूशन आया. और इसके जो ग्लोबल कॉन्सिक्वेंसेस क्या है आप जानते हो ना. सो सोशलिस्ट स्टेट बना पहला एक्सपेरिमेंट आफ्टर रिवोल्यूशन बाय लेनिन. देन उसने एक वॉर कम्युनिज्म शुरू किया, टाइट कंट्रोल ओवर एवरीथिंग, राइट? एंड अल्टीमेटली दैट गिव द ग्राउंड फॉर स्टैलिनिस्ट काइंड ऑफ कम्युनिज्म, टाइटली कंट्रोल्ड, जिसको कि विंस्टन चर्चिल कॉल्ड इट आयरन कर्टन. आगे जा करके इट लेड टू व्हाट? कोल्ड वॉर कंपटीशन, एंड वी सी 45 years ऑफ global tension, right? And one more important consequence was with the socialist kind of revolution in Russia, the fear was there in other European countries that there would be communist revolution likewise that happened in Russia. So countries like Britain adopted welfare policies, that is another consequence, and countries like Germany and Italy went on the path of fascism, right, as a reaction to the spread of communism, right? So this is explained here. So you can see it here. Provisional governments inability to resolve February crisis, catastrophic continuation of World War I, and पहला काम जो किया अक्टूबर रिवोल्यूशन ने, इससे बाहर आना, right? Failure of land reforms, that is second. Third, economic distress, right? And उसकी वजह से food riots, food crisis, and structural crisis of dual power. Dual power crisis क्या था जो मैंने बात नहीं की पहले? Provisional government and Petrograd Soviet. Gradually power इसके हाथ में चला गया, right? So Soviet held the actual loyalty of masses and military, right? So right wing Kornilov affair, right wing ने overthrow करने की कोशिश की, कैपिटल को थ्रेटन करने की कोशिश की. इस सिचुएशन में प्रोविजनल गवर्नमेंट gave arms power to Petrograd Soviet. It became very, very strong. It became very strong. So Bolshevik Red Guards were given the arms control, and that was used by Lenin to orchestrate his revolution, which is called October Revolution, right? Then consequences, जो अभी मैं बात कर चुका हूँ थोड़ी देर पहले. So for Russia, radical transformation, establishment of Soviet state, USSR, exit from World War I, civil war and totalitarianism. So एक सोवियत सोशलिस्ट रिपब्लिक बना, वर्ल्ड वॉर I से वो बाहर आया क्योंकि देयर वाज द मोस्ट इंपॉर्टेंट एलिगेशन अगेंस्ट प्रोविजनल गवर्नमेंट. यू आर नॉट कमिंग आउट ऑफ इट. ही केम आउट ऑफ इट बाय सीडिंग यूक्रेन एंड बाल्टिक स्टेट्स टू जर्मनी. सिविल वॉर एंड टोटलिटरियनिज्म, रेड्स और कम्युनिस्ट एंटी कम्युनिस्ट वाइट्स, इनके बीच में सिविल वॉर हुआ. तो लेनिन ने वॉर कम्युनिज्म शुरू किया, जिसने कहीं ना कहीं एक टोटलिटरियन स्टेट जो जोसेफ स्टालिन के अंडर आता है बाद में, उसके लिए ग्राउंड बना के दिया. दिस वर कॉन्सिक्वेंसेज विद इन Soviet Union. Consequences for the world: ideological polarization, rise of global communism, Comintern बना, catalyst for anti-colonial movements in different parts of the world. M.N. Roy इंडिया के एग्जाम्पल है, हो चिन मिन एंड माओ जेडोंग वियतनाम एंड चाइना के एग्जाम्पल है. Blueprint for the Cold War, we know that very well. Two camps बने, communist and capitalist camps, right? And then rise of fascism and welfare capitalist states. I have talked about that, right? Okay. Question number 20. Comment on synthesis of security needs, national identity and Western style expansionism in the rise of Japanese imperialism. Please understand, Western imperialism was different and Japanese imperialism was different. Western imperialism was primarily driven by mercantile capitalism, industrial surplus. पहले mercantile capitalism, right? जहां पे आप जाकर कहीं पे dominate करेंगे, मोनोपोली बनाएंगे ट्रेड का, उससे बहुत प्रॉफिट कमाएंगे. दैट वुड बी इन्वेस्टेड न्यू इन्वेंशंस, इंडस्ट्रीज एंड देन इंडस्ट्रियल कैपिटलिज्म. उसके थ्रू भी और पावर एंड देन फर्दर एक्सपांशन ऑफ कॉलोनियल एम्पायर्स. हुआ ये, नाउ द कॉलोनियलिज्म थ्रेटन्ड जापान. एशिया में तो आ चुका था. सो जापान रिएक्शन, राइट, जापान ने खुद का फिर एक्सपांशनिस्ट ट्रैजेक्टरी शुरू किया, बॉर्न आउट ऑफ कैलकुलेटेड डिफेंसिव रिस्पॉन्स. इन डिफेंस ऑफ व्हाट? We should not become victim of Western imperialism, right? Okay. So it represented a potent synthesis of acute security anxieties. कहीं हम कॉलोनी ना बन जाए यूएस की या फिर दूसरे यूरोपियन पावर्स की. Manufactured state-centric national identity. In order to create that sentiment of self-sacrifice for the country, a strong identity was required. So they did that. And then Western-style gunboat diplomacy. Gun और boat. Domination बनाओ oceans के ऊपर, use the military power. So that kind of thing was done. So three things: security needs, national identity and Western style expansionism. These things are explained in the answer. So three pillars of Japanese imperialism. Security needs, clear cut था clear cut था यहाँ पे. You can see it here. US commander Matthew Perry in 1853, उसने forced opening of Japan, right? And the subsequent uneven treaties exposed nations' vulnerability to Western colonization. Japan was forced to sign treaties. That is when Meiji rule वहाँ पे, they understood that if we remain weak, we'll one day be victim of the Western imperialism. It's better to strengthen ourselves, right? So security was most important. Security need was most important aspect of Japan's later expansionism. So cord of sovereignty versus line of advantage. Cord of sovereignty versus line of advantage. So sovereignty means what? We should not lose our sovereignty to US or any other Western power. And in order to protect that, we have to secure the line of advantage. That is which goes through Manchuria and Korea. Korean Peninsula में कोई आना नहीं चाहिए. You can see it somewhere. So, yes, Korea and Manchuria, right? So we must keep our domination over these regions. यहाँ पे Western powers आ गए तो next victim is Japan, and that's why इसको secure करना बहुत जरूरी है. National identity, right? Kakutai and state Shinto, right? Imperial restoration. Emperor was elevated from symbolic figurehead to a divine absolute ruler through state Shinto. Please understand, emperor is divine. Just give your ultimate loyalty. Do everything for the state. तो nation के लिए सब कुछ करो. That identity most important thing, right? So national identity इस तरह से build की गई. So Bushido and militarized nationalism, right? Traditional samurai code of Bushido was democratized, infused into public education through imperial rescript on education. वो जो samurai है ना, elite लोगों तक सीमित मत रखो उसको पूरे mass तक लेके जाओ. Everybody becomes a martial kind of person and fights for the country. So that's how that identity was built by Japan, aggressive kind of nationalism, right? And then Western style expansionism, I have explained that. So Western toolkit was used, imperialist toolkit, gunboat kind of technique, right? They meticulously studied Western colonial techniques and they tried to adopt it, right? Aggressive treaty revision. So first Sino-Japanese war and Russo-Japanese war, ये दो एग्जांपल्स थे जहां पे जापान ने अपना वो जो नया एक्सपांशनिज्म है वो दिखाना शुरू कर दिया, राइट? Monroe Doctrine for Asia. Japan utilized Western legalistic pretext such as fear of influence politics. वो जो हुआ था ना खलीफेट में बाद में, राइट? और जगह पे अफ्रीका में स्फीयर ऑफ इन्फ्लुएंस, तो इन्होंने ये प्ली यूज किया. सो ग्रेटर ईस्ट एशिया को प्रॉस्पेरिटी स्फीयर. You talk about sphere politics, we talk about prosperity sphere politics. So Western toolkit adapted by Japan to go for its own version of expansionism, imperialism, right? So उन तीनों का synthesis दिया हुआ यहाँ पे, security needs and national identity and Western emulation. Then there is a conclusion, right? Okay, so that's how Japan, out of these three needs, security, national identity and Western style expansionism को as a tool use करके they create their own expansionism and imperialism. That's why Japanese imperialism was different as compared to Western imperialism. Yeah, I know I have kept it short and quite summarized kind of discussion, but content is quite large for you to assimilate, understand, and if the questions come, this could be quite useful to you in the mains. All right, so that's what I want to discuss with you today. Thank you so much. Let's stop here.